Okay, I believe we are live. I'm going to double check really quick. So if any of you guys are currently on with us, I'm not really sure of it yet. But nonetheless, if you are, welcome to what is not really an episode of Unapologetics. It's more just a straightforward debate. I am joined here today with Mr. Mathew Steele, who has reached out to me, and we're going to actually debate on the subject of the problem of evil today. The way we're phrasing it exactly is if God, why evil, to avoid any sort of a affirmative. It does appear we are live. Awesome. So, yeah, I'm joined here today with Mathew Steele. Mathew, thank you for being here.
I'm very happy to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, I have as well. And I want to briefly apologize to the audience simply because, I did actually expect this to be on Monday. I ended up having to push it back a couple hours, and then we ended up having some unforeseen circumstances after that. And then today I was expecting it to happen at 4, but once again, I had to push it back due to some unforeseen circumstances. And I apologize for that because I know people who watch this are pretty used to me not actually being on time because there seems like there's always some unforeseen circumstances, you know what I mean? But nonetheless, it was all my fault. So I apologize to the audience there, and we'll definitely make sure that we're getting a little bit more on time for you guys in the future. Maybe just initially I could just not announce stuff until we have things set in stone. That would probably be the best idea. But nonetheless, we're going to be happy to have a conversation here with you guys today. I don't have any sort of announcements or anything because, like I said, this isn't a traditional show. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right into this. And I got a 15-minute timer. I want to let you guys know our format. We're going to have 15-minute or less opening statements, depending on how long the opening statements happen to be, and 10-minute or less rebuttals afterwards. And I will be going first, followed by, of course, Mr. Steele. And then we're going to go into a 30-minute open dialogue and a 5 to 10-minute closing for each speaker afterwards. If you guys do have questions, do go ahead and throw them into the live chat. We're more than happy to answer any questions you have. We're not going to answer any ridiculous questions. So, I know people say that there's no such thing as a stupid question. That is not the case. So just know that, right? Nonetheless, let's go ahead and get right into it. I'll set this up. And once again, Mr. Steele, I appreciate you being here. And timer is starting now. So I'm getting in the habit of preparing my remarks. So I do actually have prepared remarks here today for you guys. So I want to start by saying blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, to whom I will give all the glory today. I, of course, do want to thank Mr. Steele again for having the discussion with me today, and thank everybody watching this, both live and after the fact. The question before us today, if God, why evil, has been commonly termed the Epicurean paradox before the Greeks actually had experience with true monotheistic religion in the form of the Abrahamic faiths, and also termed by many modern-day philosophers and subsequent philosophers as the problem of evil. It happens to actually be a question that I have thought a lot about, and I would actually like to say right off the bat that I sympathize greatly with any atheist or Christian or whatever you happen to be when you agonize about the problem of evil. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I have relatively cynical thoughts on the matter, so I definitely feel you. Human beings to a man are pretty well always degenerate creatures capable of an almost mythical cruelty. We're hostile to men and beasts alike. We're defilers of the very earth itself and abusers of our own bodies and minds. Animals, if anybody tries to find some sort of solace there, are vicious, barbaric, devouring to survive because they have to, and committing just about every heinous act that one could possibly think of and that man could partake of himself. They're innocent not because they're good per se, but because they're ignorant and don't really have a concept of morality. But if we actually examined their actions, their horrible actions that lead to nothing but suffering for all creatures involved, and they're certainly anything but positive. And even inanimate nature itself and our universe seems determined to make existence as miserable as possible, not only for sentient life, but even for the other inanimate objects in the solar system. Whether we have plagues or hurricanes or supernovas or the inevitability of death, nature just seems chaotic and predisposed to destruction, absolutely hostile towards life. And so I just want to say, acknowledging these things, I greatly sympathize with anybody who has asked this question. If there is supposed to be this omnibenevolent God who cares about us all, why do we live in a universe that is structured this way? The atheist and Christian alike might be a little bit shocked to discover that the Holy Bible actually fully recognizes the miseries of our existence. What philosophers have commonly called the absurd, meaning the absurdity of human existence and the need for some sort of meaning in the futility of human existence, theologians have long attributed to the fall, i.e. the fall of man in the garden. Scripture informs us that men are totally depraved and shaped in iniquity, that we are slaves to our sin. The heart is deceitful above all things, and our actions are to God as mere breath. Our righteousness is as filthy rags, and our curse is above all of the beasts of the earth. The wages of sin is death, and by sin did death enter into the world. In other words, the Bible definitely agrees with this question and acknowledges the inevitable fact that life is suffering and that human beings in particular are quite wicked. Ecclesiastes, in my opinion, puts it as simply as it could possibly be put, saying, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. Once again, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. It kind of reminds me of the Ozymandias poem by Percy Shelley. I am Ozymandias, king of kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, in despair. And yet, what do we find of Ramesses' empire? Absolutely nothing, buried in dirt, right? And that's the nature of things. It seems very nihilistic, and the Bible fully recognizes this. So the question before us today, obviously, is why? The scriptures very much agree that the world is a hostile and evil place, but do they give us any insight as to why that is? And I venture to prove today that indeed the scripture does provide us all that we need to understand the suffering in our world, at least as much as the human mind could, because the Bible is clear. God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and he knows things that we could not possibly know, and of course, considering his different attributes, omniscient, eternal, so on and so forth. Before I proceed, though, I would like to make a very important point, at least in my own opinion. Evil only exists as a shadow or absence of good. It is much like darkness or cold in that sense. Without a concrete definition of what is good, without an objective value system by which we can actually measure goodness and its absence badness, the term evil does become essentially meaningless and is at best synonymous with the term not preferable. I don't want to make the crux of my argument dependent on this, but I believe the only good argument for objective morality is the existence of a personal God. And so I posit to you that the very existence of evil is in and of itself an argument for God. At best, the argument from evil can prove God does not meet your personal moral standards of morality, or that he could be mean or unkind, maybe predisposed to hostility towards life. But it could, or rather, it could call into question his character in general, though I would, of course, contest each of these points. But it cannot, in my opinion, be used as an argument against the existence of God, because on the contrary, it would actually imply his existence. But let's move forward on that point to what I would consider some of the more substantial arguments. My first point to explain evil is the aforementioned fall. The book of Genesis is rather explicit in attributing many of the worst things in life to the fall of man. Genesis 3 verses 16 through 19 gives us the following. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And to Adam, he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. And you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat the bread, till you return unto the ground. For out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Pretty harsh. We see here that things like pain in childbearing, continuous labor, and consuming to survive, and even death itself, among other things, are miseries that are experienced by man as a direct result of the fall of man. Put in a different way, our fallen nature, the wages of our fallen nature is so heavy, right? The death that is the wages of our fallen nature is so heavy that it curses the very ground and the beasts themselves. In a sense, one could certainly argue that all suffering is a direct result of this moment. As I just stated, the wages of sin is death, and that is the whole point of needing a savior in the first place. But the story of Adam's fall provides for us a precedent and explains many other instances of individual human suffering, namely punishment for sin. God does indeed punish the wicked as he must if he were to be a just and righteous judge. And we see many instances of God's judgment throughout Scripture. God floods the world in Genesis 7, condemns the Canaanites to judgment in Deuteronomy 20, and judges the Hebrews themselves, his own people, in Matthew 24, which is a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem, amongst other things. Whilst it is not fair to say all of our suffering is direct judgment from God, and I certainly would not make that case, it must clearly be stated that some of our suffering is direct judgment from God, and how much only God would know. But in the fall and in the concept of sin, we do actually see what are some biblical explanations for suffering and evil in the world. The very thing that God is judging, i.e. human sin, provides us another explanation for human suffering. Human sin is often freely done against other humans. In Deuteronomy 30:19, we find, quote, "I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live," end quote. Now, this is in particular referring to the Israelites, but the precedent is very clear. God has provided us all a guidebook which tells us exactly how we can avoid suffering by living morally and loving both our neighbors and our enemies as ourselves. Whether or not we will freely follow to this provided path is within our own decision-making capabilities, and many of us will not. Human beings freely choose to disregard God's ordinances by committing murder, by committing rape, by committing theft, by kidnapping, and so on. They freely choose to disregard his commands to be kind to your beast in Proverbs, or to be not harsh with your wives in Ephesians, or to marry women after the flowering of their age in Corinthians, and so on and so forth. Human sin and the world, because human sin is inevitable in the world, because free will guarantees a certain level of evil within those creatures. Put another way, free creatures will always be free to make bad choices, and unfortunately, bad choices will often appeal to our hedonistic tendencies, many of which involve imposition of will on other human beings and animals and so on. A solution to this is provided in the plain commands of Scripture. Love your neighbor as yourself, do good unto those who persecute you, and treat others as yourself would be treated. Another solution to this is provided in the sacrifice of Christ himself, as he is the salvation for our sins, right? He changes the hearts. The Holy Spirit baptizes us and changes our hearts so that we might live morally and want to actually treat human beings and animals and so on and so forth in a better way, whilst also washing us of our own sins, right? So it's kind of a cool thing in the sense that it leads you to live a moral life, but also admonishes you for those instances of immorality, provided that, of course, you truly repent. The book of Job provides us yet another explanation for human sin. And many people are quick to point to the book of Job as somewhat harsh and cruel nature of God. I posit to you that the opposite is actually true. Many are quick to point to God's speeches in the book of Job, but it is actually the beginning of the book, which in my opinion provides the most relevant verses in this book. In Job chapter 1, 8 through 12, we read the following. "And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord." And that's where we end the quote. Here we see that one of the biblical explanations for suffering and evil is the testing of God's saints in the world. When the accuser, that is the Hebrew Satan, indicts the believer in God's heavenly court, the accuser is shown by the Most High God himself that his people are free of all sin. In this, we see an amazing truth brought to fruition in the person of Christ. On that great and dreadful day of the Lord, when the judge condemns all the unrighteous, it is God himself in the person of Christ who defends the elect from all charges. We are covered by the blood of the God-man himself, and the Lord has tried us with a purifying fire. The prosecution must crumble and rest at this point. But the test doesn't only indicate God's own, but it also removes those who are not. When men experience some level of trial and scoff at Jehovah, they reveal that their hearts were always truly against him. And this is pretty easy to prove. Imagine loving your father only when you got your favorite cereal. Imagine hating your mother because your brother was a bully. The Lord is not obligated to bless anyone, and yet he does so, and abundantly, yet men refuse to acknowledge him or let their love for him rest on their pleasure. We see how the righteous people respond in Job 121. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of Jehovah. So the saints are shown to be vindicated by the blessings and grace of our God. I will quickly point out that Job did indeed experience heavy doubts when his suffering got to a point where it was what many would consider to be unbearable. And God does not damn us for having these doubts, even though the Lord does like us to respond, I think, in the earlier fashion Job did. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of Jehovah. I do think that God understands that we suffer and understand things from a human perspective. And I even think that's part of the reason why he came down to suffer from a human perspective along with us. The final point I wish to argue is the argument from ignorance or, well, really, that's all I could call it for lack of a better term. As Christians, which I know that Mr. Steele is obviously going to be arguing from an atheist perspective, but I do speak to the Christians in this point. As Christians, we affirm that God has a plan in mind for us all. The Bible tells us that all things work together for good for those who are called according to the purposes of God. A character must play his or her role in the story, and it is not for the character to determine what is or is not his experiences. But Christians can rest assured that the author of this book that is life has a plan in mind for his creatures. He loves us and has redeemed us by the blood of Messiah. When God asked Job, "Why do I send rain on the desert where no man is?" he is making a very simple and powerful point. He knows, and we do not. Ooh, looks like I'm actually out of time there. I was just going to finish that Ecclesiastes starts off by declaring everything is meaningless, but it ends with a solution to our dread, saying, and a meaning for our lives, rather, saying, fear God and keep commandments, for this is the sole duty of man. So it was actually only one sentence past time. I apologize for that.
That's just fine. I mean, we are doing this without moderation, and I appreciate you being so stringent in moderating yourself. That's very, very appreciated.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And let me know when you are ready to go, Mr. Steele, and I will start the timer for you.
You can go ahead and start it.
All righty.
The difficult role for me here is in deciding whether to argue as an atheist or to steelman Christianity and say that it's all true. So on the one hand, I would have to make an argument about evil as an atheist. On the other, I would have to say, okay, the Bible is true, so how do we explain evil? So I think I will briefly state my own position on how I make sense of evil in the world as an atheist, but for the majority of my time, I will try to express what I understand evil to mean from a Christian perspective as best I can. So to me, evil is the way that it makes the most sense is not that it is suffering. Some suffering in life is just part of life itself that is unavoidable. I don't think that it's necessarily always what you would call in the Christian worldview evil itself. Sometimes to suffer for the ones that you love is actually to do a good thing rather than a bad thing. So I think the best way to explain it from my atheistic perspective is that evil is to choose to do harm and cause suffering to someone else for a reason other than to benefit them. Now, a doctor has to perform surgery on someone, and that would cause suffering, hence the use of anesthetics, which are a rather recent invention. But before that, there were no anesthetics to speak of, although you had certain options. The suffering that was being caused by a doctor is still for the good of the person they're trying to save. So there has to be a differentiation between causing suffering and the intent to harm. So that then begs the question of why should we have any value for others such that we wouldn't want them to feel harm? And that comes from, I believe, self-worth, self-preservation, and the ability to empathize with others and understand that you're enough like them that if you don't want to suffer yourself and you can relate to them, then you don't want them to suffer either. You never escape the selfishness of your own actions in terms of benefiting yourself. I don't believe there is ever a truly altruistic act except to sacrifice your life for someone. But I do believe that mitigating or minimizing the suffering of others as much as possible is, in my worldview, the opposite of evil, which would be good. So that would, of course, call into question, and feel free to ask me any questions you want about how I justify what is and isn't good or moral. But I think that I have to address now the problem of evil as you've described it and as I've learned over the years from a Christian perspective. And I took some notes while you were talking, and everything you were describing is basically how I understand the most generally accepted explanation for sin and death and evil, pain and suffering across Christianity, from one end to the other. There are a few issues that do cause general disagreement, I've found, among all Christians, such as, is a sin passed on regardless of whether or not you're committing an act? Is it something that is intrinsic, or is it something that's only based on your actions themselves once you're able to intentionally commit them? These are the sort of things that I've noticed that some Christians do disagree on. But for the most part, let's just grant all that you've said is true according to the Bible. I'm perfectly fine with doing that. My issue is not with explaining evil as from a Christian perspective. The issue is not explaining evil. If evil is just, as you said, an absence of good, similar to a shadow where there's an absence of light, then there is there's a varying degree at all times of goodness. So there isn't actually any evil to speak of. So if you are doing a varying degree of good or not, since evil itself doesn't exist as a thing, it is only an absence of good or a less amount of good, then God's will is still being served. His plan is still being carried out. So evil in that way just represents a smaller percentage, and it could be a tiny, tiny percentage, depending on whether you're judging someone based on a specific action or you're talking about the sum total of everything they've done in their life when they're being judged by God at the moment of their death to find out what will happen to them for eternity. I think at that point, it is a matter of calculating up how much, if free will is the case, according to the biblical doctrines as you've explained, how much have they tried to serve God? And that is always going to be calculated not in the amount of evil that they've done, but in the amount of good that they haven't done. So I guess it would be like saying that a glass, the way I guess you're explaining it is that it would be like a glass that's not full. The air is not something that is filling up the glass from your perspective. If the glass is completely full, then you have Jesus. If the glass is not full, then you have a human being, and it's going to be less water in the glass, depending on how carefully a person tried to follow the will of God. But even if there is one drop of water in that glass, they are still following God's plan, and they are contributing towards his goodness in the way that he wants. If we can't know the mind of God, then we can't actually ever determine if our actions are not causing someone else to get closer to God. Maybe that is the point. For someone to have a great deal of suffering in their life, to make bad choices, they might be, according to God's plan, they might be serving him by providing an example or a lesson for someone else that is going to have greater consequences down the line to further that plan. So trying to understand why this situation of the fall occurred in the first place isn't something I think as humans reading the Bible, granting that the Bible is true, I don't think that's something we could ever figure out. I think it's one of God's mysteries. But I don't think there is an actual problem of evil. There is just degrees of service to God. So something can be truly horrible, but still be serving God's will. I don't think there's ever been a person born, I would assume this, and I would stand by this. I don't think there's ever been a person born who hasn't done something good at some point in their life. So to follow the plan as it's been set out, even the most horrible human being who's ever lived, whoever that person might have been, would still be serving God. So they're choosing not to do that and hurting themselves in the bargain. So I guess to make evil make sense to me from a Christian perspective would be to defer to God's commands and your place in the larger picture. It would be an acknowledgement of what a small part you are in the grander scheme of things. And that requires you to humble yourself. And most people are not willing to do that. Atheist or believer alike, it doesn't matter. It's very difficult to humble yourself and accept that you have something to learn, or there's something that you could do better. So we, of course, come to problems like, do you believe that the Earth is only a few thousand years old or billions of years old? If it's billions of years old and evolution is true, let's just hypothetically, if evolution is true, There are many Christians who do believe that. That means that people have been alive for hundreds of thousands of years, and the Bible was only written 3,500, started to be written 3,500 years ago, 4,000 years ago at the most, which means that all the people before that would have only been on the receiving end of general revelation instead of the opportunity of salvation. So it would make sense for us historically to commit more evil because life would feel more hopeless. If there's one thing that's the salvation offered by Jesus does provide us, it is that capacity for redemption and hope that people didn't have before. And all that people were able to accept before was, no matter how horrible my life is, no matter what bad things happen to me, this is still God's plan. And for someone who's had a truly horrible life, that would be very difficult to accept. And it would make some people resentful. And people are weak. And people do tend to act selfishly, no matter what the situation. And that is completely understandable, considering that we are imperfect creatures. And our nature itself still, despite the fall, just to close out my opening statement, despite the fall, we still never stop serving God's will. My own understanding of evil, though, is that it is inescapable. It's just something, comparatively with Christians, we share this in our understandings of reality. To make the world a better place for everyone around us, we should try not to harm. And regardless of where those beliefs come from, that is a lessening of what we're both considering to be evil. It's just a matter of the what is being respected and honored or not. So that's all I would have to say. And I think that probably puts me right under 15 minutes.
Yep, just about hitting 14. We're 13 seconds removed from 14. So just so the audience knows, we're now going to go into 10 second, or 10 minutes, 10 second. That would be hilarious. 10 second. I said it again. You got to be kidding me. 10-minute, excuse me, people. 10-minute rebuttal period. I will be going first, of course, followed by Mr. Steele again, and then we'll jump into a 30-minute cross-examination, which I will be reiterating once again once we get to that point, just so you guys are informed on the format. I know there's probably some people who are just coming in. Also, if you guys do want to ask questions, go ahead and throw questions in that live chat. We will take, if there's any actual questions to answer, we will take some questions at the end of this. But nonetheless, let me get 10 minutes started. And here we go. All right. So there was a couple things that were definitely interesting there I wanted to address. So the first thing is we did see the suffering is not necessarily evil. And I think this is an interesting concept, philosophically speaking, because in my opinion, I would say that suffering is absolutely evil, but that being in a fallen world, sometimes certain evils become necessary. As a perfect example, there is, and I'm not a follower of the Talmud, by the way, lest anyone get confused, but there is an old proverb in the Talmud that says, those who will be merciful to the cruel will eventually be cruel to the merciful. And the concept being that kind of the same idea is just legal punishment, right? If you don't actually take certain members out of the society, we do that in the form of prisons, right? Either to rehabilitate them or to punish them or whatever your theories happen to be. We can all agree that if we don't remove these people from the society, right, they will eventually, because we're being too merciful to them, be cruel to somebody who does not deserve it, right? But notice, implicit in that is not necessarily this idea that, for example, in the case of prisons, that breaking down people's doors and kidnapping them and throwing them in a box for the next 10 years is a moral thing. We would agree that that's an immoral action, but that greater immoral actions from other people lead us to have to do such and such a thing. I would say the same thing about giving your life for somebody. death, in my opinion, is a example of evil. But occasionally in this fallen world, death is, well, it's always necessary, of course, everybody dies, but sometimes it's necessary for some sort of altruistic means. Like, for example, some people have died in the name of science. Some people have died to preserve their nation. Some people have died to protect their families, so on and so forth, right? Police and soldiers and firefighters and all that sort of stuff have occasionally fought for honorable causes as well, right? Now, I understand that this is probably somewhat of a philosophical difference, considering the fact that I am a Christian, and I in the end think that suffering in itself comes as a result of human sin, right? That is pretty key in the understanding of the fall of man. However, with that being said, I would argue that in a world without evil, human beings would have no need to suffer, and neither would animals for that matter. I don't think we would be eating meat. I don't think there would be diseases. I don't think hurricanes would come forward. So, and now perhaps that is a philosophical presupposition of mine that needs to be challenged. Of course, we'll see. But that's just something I wanted to kind of respond to there. So the definition we had of evil: to choose to do harm to someone maliciously. Sort of agree. It's an interesting thing in a lot of ways. As a moral absolutist, and sort of building upon what I just said, I would be inclined to agree in the sense that, for example, I would not condemn all soldiers, but I would say every time a soldier has ever taken the life of another soldier, that was an absolutely evil act. I would posit that the potential evil act that would happen as a result of not killing that opposing soldier could end up being worse, and that only happens as a result of our fallen world. To give an example, people commonly bring the lying to a Nazi dilemma, right? If you lie to a Nazi about the Jews in your basement, have you done an immoral act? As a moral absolutist, I would argue yes, but I would argue that the act of telling the Nazi about those Jews is a greater immorality than the lie you tell to preserve their life. And if you think about it, absolute morality actually requires such a value system. 3 and 1 are absolute values, and 3 is absolutely greater than 1, right? So the very nature of an absolute value system kind of requires you to have certain things that would, in the end, carry a greater value than others. So I would agree that choosing to do harm to someone maliciously is evil, but I would also posit that in a world like ours, sometimes doing such a thing becomes justified, and then therefore in a sort of roundabout and albeit bastardized sense good, because the avoiding of it would be a greater evil. And of course, I just used the Nazi Jew example, but one of the more famous examples that is starting to become used is the kid at the dentist example, right? The kid at the dentist is put under significant amounts of pain, but the greater evil there would be growing up with a root canal in your entire life and having to deal with that pain. And because of that, we had the causing of suffering versus intent to harm. And I would sort of just posit that in the same general thing, right? I think that is a question of, in a perfect world, would suffering happen in the first place? I would agree that intent to harm would be gone, but suffering in and of itself, just as an example, I don't have any intent to harm a cow, right? But cows do have to suffer in this world because I eat meat. I guess they don't necessarily have to, but we have, that's a huge conversation in itself. The point is, animals do suffer so humans can have sustenance, right? That's not necessarily malicious. I would definitely argue that it's not perfectly good, I guess is the way I would put it. Maybe not necessarily, or I guess I would say that would be a definition of evil. If it would be outside of perfectly good, then it would be evil, because, that would be kind of the same thing with the light example, right? If something was perfectly lit, there would be no darkness in it, and so on and so forth. So I had a little bit of a thought there in the middle of my rebuttal here, but nonetheless, we continue. So we can base morality and self-preservation, empathy, and these are legitimate reasons for repulsions against evil. I am going to actually grant that simply because that's not the point of this debate. I would certainly challenge that on a different time, but I feel like we really don't want to get bogged down in that, because that's not the point of this particular conversation. And I did just want to comment on this because I actually think it's almost 100% true. The idea of no true altruism. I do believe there is such thing as true altruism for sure, But I think a lot of things that people think is altruistic is really not altruistic. Some people want to be heroes, so they do things that are quote unquote altruistic. A lot of people care for their friends and family because of the emotional stimulus that they get from those friends and family, so on and so forth. So I thought that was interesting, and it was actually an interesting point that we could agree on. So we were asked the question, is sin intrinsic? I would posit to you that to the human being, sin is intrinsic, and that is a necessity of having a truly free moral agency. People have often asked me the question, does God have a free moral agency in the same way that humans do, or posited a different way? Do human beings have a free moral agency in heaven? That question is incredibly complicated, and I think I could be wrong on this, but I would actually argue that probably not. I think if we were purged of the ability or intent to do evil, then our will wouldn't necessarily be free. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's the whole reason why we're here in the first place, is so that we have the free will to choose that by our own accord, right? And giving our own personal consent. But nonetheless, I think having free will leads human beings inevitably to commit acts of sin because, quite frankly, sins benefit human beings. If I don't like a person and I beat that person up, or I murder that person, or I slander that person, I've ruined that person's reputation. It benefits me, right? If I happen to have some horribly, barbaric view of women and they decide that they don't want to be around me as a result, well, it benefits me to not take no for an answer. If I need money, right, well, then it benefits me to go into a bank and take that money. So on and so forth. And because these benefits exist, human beings will inevitably make those decisions. Now, other human beings will take into account other things, their moral compass, empathy, so on and so forth. But the mere existence of freedom of will guarantees that each and every human being will commit at least one of these acts, maybe not the heinous ones, but maybe some of the smaller ones, like a little white lie, right? Or looking upon another woman with lust or something along those lines, because sin is inherently hedonistic, virtually always. It has benefits to the human being in the here and now. We have the claim that evil is not a thing per se, which I agree with, by the way. Therefore, God's will is always still being carried out. And I think it may shock people to know that I think not only is this correct, but I think this is the clear teaching of Scripture. And let me give an example, as a real-world example. And by real world, I mean in the current world that you could experience today, not having to rely necessarily on my holy book, right? If you were to write a story, many people do, of course, right? In a ultimate sense, every act of your protagonist, your antagonist, your active and non-active character alike is done by your pen and for your pleasure. That is the very nature of creating a story, right? I often use the example of Star Wars because it's very popular. Darth Vader did absolutely everything he did, which includes but is not limited to genocide, the murder of children. I guess that's actually my time. So I'll just wrap that thought up by saying that is the nature of being an author, that in the end, all things are done in a sense by your pen and for your glory and pleasure. And I'd concede there because I don't want to take too much time.
I'm glad he matches yours. That I have interpreted it correctly, even though I don't accept it. I want to have the best understanding of it that I can. That's the reason that I do this. Is it's almost a compulsion in me to try to understand how other people see things, to figure out whether I'm wrong or not. And there have been a great many things that I've learned that I was wrong about, just by talking to people like yourself. And those are life-changing realizations a lot of times. You understand, I've been wrong about this all along. I've been thinking this for 10 years or 20 years. When you have that sort of a realization, it can... rather than ramble on, I'll just say that I don't understand why people avoid arguments, because to talk to someone who sees things differently is the only way that your ideas can ever be challenged, because we do tend to be selfish and lazy and to not have conflict in our own minds just for the peace, the lack of anxiety about that conflict. So it's important to me to accept that pain, that suffering, mental anguish is there. So in a way, that forms a metaphor, or an analogy, I should say, of how important it can be to have something that is evil itself, as we've both agreed that it is, to have that as part of the equation. And to speak to what you said about authors, it would be a pretty boring story if everything were perfect all the time. I mean, what this all leads me to wonder, and this, I guess, would be like questioning George Lucas about Star Wars, why he wrote this or that. But I would really like to understand why free will was instituted in the first place, why that choice was given to people in the Bible. If it was inevitably going to, and with God being all-knowing at all times, everywhere at once, he knew what was going to happen, not prescriptively, so to speak, but he could see that we were going to make that choice, how it would play out. It's all very nebulous. I know it's not something that we can speak definitively on for what his intention was, of course, but it makes me wonder how what we describe as evil and all of the suffering that people go through, all the terrible things that people do to each other, pedophiles and rapists and slave owners, and just all of the horrible things that people have done, why this story had to be written this way. Now, that is, I would never lower myself to using, well, this is all God's fault. Because if we have free will, it's our fault still. It was Adam and Eve's fault still, if we have free will. So even though he's writing the story and deciding how the ending will come out, we are still making those choices. My question is, why does evil have to exist at all? So that's not something that I think there's an easy answer for. We can answer why there is suffering. Just to come back to my own perspective, I see the world as inherently senseless in terms of trying to understand it. We have to start from a point of making sense of it. The action of trying to do that, to make sense of it and to rationalize it to ourselves, is something we're doing for our own, I guess the easiest way to put it would be our own peace of mind. We try to make sense of it so that we can sleep better at night and so that we aren't as afraid. We try to make sense of it, but there are parts of it that will never make sense. We'll never be able to answer why things are so horrible sometimes, why people have to go through their lives hurting so many people around them. Ted Bundy, for example, what makes a man like that do the things that he did. Jeffrey Dahmer, there's a particularly heinous, I don't even want to bring his name up, but there was a police officer in Florida who had a really nasty way of torturing two girls at the same time. And I wonder what causes people to do things like this. And even in the Christian perspective, making sense of things as a Christian, that is not something that we could have an objective answer for it. We're doing that because of the fall. We're doing that because man is inherently selfish. And the analogy that I used before was with the glass being always going to have some emptiness in it, some, it's not full except for Jesus. No matter how full your glass is, there's always going to be some of that in the world. And making sense of that, if I were a Christian, I would have a very hard time with that. And that's why I think that this is really the core dynamic of Christianity, making sense of that as a Christian, and also trying to make sense of it as an atheist. We have the same problem. We're limited in the same way of there's going to be this horrible thing that we all have to face up to as we get older, we become an adult. Something terrible is going to happen to us. We're going to see it happen, or we're going to do it ourselves and then realize later just how bad it was. Making sense of that sometimes will drive you nuts. And I'll say again, it would be great if there were a loving God. It would be. It would make things much easier. And that's why it always confuses me when I do get the argument that I'm choosing not to acknowledge God, because it would make things make so much more sense. But at the end of the day, we're still left with the question of why is it the way things are? So you have God to trust, you have Jesus to save you, and that helps make things make more sense than the way I see things. And it's incredibly more satisfying. But I still can't accept that that's the way things are as reality. I'm doing my best to see things through the Christian perspective, and I thank you for entertaining that, despite how you believe the Bible to be true. I appreciate that you will give me the leeway to explore that and not challenge me when you could. That's a very generous approach, and I wish that there were more people doing that out there in these discussions. Anyway, I'm just rambling at this point, but I think my time is probably up now anyway.
I feel like you might have done this before. You're 5 seconds off from 10. In fact, I think if I wouldn't have just pressed this, you would have heard the timer just a moment ago. I do appreciate that, by the way. I appreciate any. So I like to, I like to at least pretend like I'm making friends. And who knows? A lot of times, I've not yet made what I guess I would consider a legitimate. Well, maybe I don't know if that's necessarily true. I talk to Smokey Saint quite a bit now, so maybe me and Smokey Saint could consider each other friends at this point. But either way, the point being, that is the intention is to pursue knowledge, but also to be kind to people. I don't think it's a good representation of my faith to not be that way, and frankly, I do think there's legitimacy to a lot of these questions. You know what I mean? I'm not one of those. I am a pre-sup and I am super fundamentalist, right? And I know that comes as a shock to people sometimes, but one of the fundamentals of Christianity is supposed to be loving your enemy as yourself. So, at any rate, let's go ahead and get. Oh, you know what? I see Smokey Sang is actually in the live chat right now, and so is Korag Nightwolf and Mindbreaker. Shalom to all you guys and anybody else who else is here. That's the first time I've actually looked at that. Let's go ahead and get 30 minutes set up here for a cross examination. There we go. All righty. So go ahead and I'll let you go ahead and start it off since I actually got the first word.
Well, what I was asking you before we went on air, and I think this plays directly into the topic of the debate, is since I saw that you have so many of your videos with thumbnails of a bulldog with a Rorschach mask on. Mm-hmm. Could you sum up for me briefly your take on the moral dilemma at the end?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I do just want to briefly say, for those of you who do not know, my news show is called The Watchdog, and it's got like the little black and yellow circle thing that's reminiscent of the Watchdog or Watchmen comics with a Rorschach bulldog. He's got the hat on and the Rorschach mask and all that. So my opinion of the end of the movie is, and the comics as well, because they actually do tend to be pretty in line with each other. I think Zack Snyder did a really good job at that, although, total different topic. Anyways, my conclusion was that a couple fold. Number one, I do think Rorschach was right. I think that there is a certain level of evil that I think can never be permissible at the hands of human beings. And also, I think that it was arrogant. I think that Ozymandias' arrogance, first off, his name is I think, supposed to be a representation of that, right? The poem Ozymandias is a perfect example of the arrogance of the pharaohs, right? And I think that was supposed to be the idea behind the character of Vite, right? I can't remember his first name right now. Adrian, thank you. And I think that's perfectly exemplified when Dr. Manhattan actually tells him, the world's smartest man is no better to me than the world's smartest termite. As well as perfectly represented, in the fact that Rorschach did win in a way, regardless of, you can do what you want with what happens in the future as far as are people going to buy this right-wing conspiracy site's story or not. But the story will be out there, right? That much you can confirm from the Watchmen comics, right? From the end of it itself, because they said, oh, we don't have anything. And, they make the joke about nobody taking an actor seriously. And then they go on to actually say, let's look into this journal. And I think with that, what you see is not only was the evil itself too great, but on top of that, the building this foundation on a lie left it incredibly susceptible to crumbling. And in Ozymandias' arrogance, he felt that he could set that up when in reality, no man could. And I think you've seen this in history, actually. Alexander the Great was convinced, I will bring to the world Alexandrian Greek culture and everything will be perfect. And I'm going to do it by the sword. And it lasted 10 years because that which is built upon a lie cannot stand, at least in my own opinion.
It is, I think, a very good moral question. It's funny how I learned a lot reading comic books as a kid. Mm-hmm. Aside from reading X-Men and learning how to say thank you in German and French and Russian and all of the other, multicultural characters that they had in there. Aside from that, just creeping into your understanding, because then you wonder, what does this mean? What does that mean? Then comic books hit you with things like Rorschach's decision to die rather than live with the lie. So if we go back to Job, at the beginning of the chapter, God was praising Job for being a very good man. um, hardly perfect. I don't think God was saying that he was a perfect man,
Right.
but he was definitely intrigued. And just as an aside, because I just remembered something I wanted to ask you during your opening. You didn't really mention, or you haven't talked at least, and this isn't something that I've heard you talk about before, but how do you think Satan plays into evil itself in the world? Since Satan and angels don't have the free will that people have, what do you think is their role in the state of evil versus good in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not 100% sold on the idea that why did I say aliens? I am so sorry about that. That angels have free will or not. I've heard some interesting arguments that indicates that they might, and that Lucifer is actually an example of that. But I also have a tough time believing it, because I think that would make them almost too human. They would basically be demigods at that point. You know what I mean? And that seems odd to me to be in a biblical framework. But nonetheless, my role, or my belief of the role of Satan as to what he is. The word Satan translates from Hebrew into English as the accuser. And I think that is basically exactly accurate to describe Satan and his position. Is he's basically like a corrupt prosecuting attorney. I could almost weave, a fiction for you that perfectly describes how I view Satan. Right? Imagine, in the Bronx somewhere, there's a mobster who happens to also be an attorney, and he's about to go down. But since he's going to go down, he wants to take down as many people that he can with him. Right? And he's a corrupt attorney, so he has the ability to do so. That's kind of right. Exactly. So you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That would be how I view Satan. He's not some, omnipotent being, or like there's no dualism in it. Right. I think that because he's rebellious, he wanted to, which is, like I said, part of the reason why I'm not 100% sold on the idea that angels don't have free will, but nonetheless, I think that he actually chose to like start being an accuser like that. And actually, to be fair, Satan is not actually a name. It is a title, which means accuser. Lucifer is the name, right? Beelzebub and the devil and Satan, those are all actually titles attributed to Lucifer. But nonetheless, I just wanted to make that distinction.
So it almost sounds like narratively, Lucifer provides a meta counterpoint, morally speaking, for God throughout the dialogue of the Bible. Would you agree with that?
I would say that certainly has some truth to it. He is almost so if this were to be a fiction, like if I were to put myself in the position of an atheist scholar who was looking at this, it would appear to me that Satan was almost a caricature of human sin. Right? He's supremely arrogant. He wants to be put above the Most High. He has, of course, the famous speech, "I will ascend above the heavens. I will be like the Most High." I think that's kind of a good way to describe Satan, and I would just say that he's the real version of that, right? Rather than actually being a fiction, it would be that he's the real. And the big part of that, I think, is because really all human beings can become a caricature of human sin if we don't check ourselves, right? I've often made the comment before that if you leave babies to their own devices and just let them grow up, I honestly think that they would grow up to be basically sociopaths, because I think that humans are sociopathic in part of our nature. There's a certain level in all humans where it's like, I really want to do things for me. There's also a certain level that says I want to do things for other people. But we even, we talked about it kind of in the beginning with the idea of no true altruism. Humans are pretty inherently selfish, self-centered arrogant, narcissistic, so on and so forth creatures. You know what I mean? We like to do stuff that benefits us. And in a sense, I think almost all forms of evil boil down to that. And so, when, you know, not only would I call Satan sort of a caricature of human evil in that sense, I would say that he's not a caricature that's impossible, whereas most caricatures usually are, right? A paragon of virtue doesn't exist in the real world, except for, in my belief, of course, Jesus. But really, a lot of us are pretty easily capable of becoming a paragon of evil things. Sorry, go ahead.
To sum up where we are in the discussion then, through our openings and our rebuttals and now this open conversation, just to sum it up, from the Christian perspective of evil, and what we seem to both agree on is that with evil being an absence of God's goodness, or a lesser amount in the way of less light becoming shadow. Since evil is something that is inextricably tied to human history and human nature and the choices that we make based on free will, and all of this, if we could, as an author, and I hope you don't think that me, by using the term author to look at this story of the Bible, I'm always doing that as an atheist criticizing it as fiction. There are a great many biographies and nonfiction books out there as well. I just mean author as in the person responsible for creating the story.
Right.
Okay, so for the story that we have, since I think we can both agree we're never going to understand why God wrote it the way that he did so that we would have free will and the choices that we make would result in the world that we have. Is that fair to say?
I would say partially. And the only reason I would say that, because you are definitely in line, like there's a lot of things that we just do not have the capability of knowing. But I think God does provide for us a little bit of points that'll help us understand. And I think the biggest one really is the idea that you freely choose communion with him, right? And you see the Bible very often describe the union of Christ and the church in the same way it describes a union of husband and wife, right? And I think that is kind of the idea, right? Is it's a union, not necessarily romantic, obviously, but it's a union of love that is freely chosen and only could be freely chosen if people recognized their place, for lack of a better term, right? Because we're not gods, and to a certain extent, I think this goes into a lot of the different laws for like, for example, homosexuality. This is just an opinion of mine, right? But I think it's representative of, God and God doesn't make a proper union, and human doesn't make a proper union, but human and God does make a proper union. And I personally take the position that humans kind of play a almost typification of the feminine in that, and that is why that would be my explanation also for why God takes on the masculine. Which, of course, this is all super nebulous stuff that I kind of bring in to explain what I'm saying there. But the point being, that is an example of somewhat of an understanding that the Bible does provide for us in that sense, right? And I think another way that we can understand it is it does allow, the attributes of God to actually be lived out. God, in my opinion, is the eternal judge, but in time is when you judge, not in eternity, right? He's an eternal redeemer, but you need time and something to redeem, so on and so forth. And obviously, I wouldn't say those are total explanations. And that's where I would concede to your point, where it's like we really can't know the totality of God's thoughts, as he says himself in Isaiah. But I do think he gives us some little hints as to things that play a part.
So he has this wish or intention or hope, desire, whatever the term you want to use, but his hope is that we will choose to be good, to serve him, to do his will, and do as little evil as possible. knowing that we won't ever be able to be perfectly good, that is still what he hopes and intends for us. So if evil results from us falling short of that mark and making the negative balance in that glass of water of empty space, then it's hard for me to reconcile free will with divine command. That's one aspect of Christianity that I haven't been able to figure out yet. So maybe you could help me understand that.
Yeah, certainly. And I will say that my view on this is somewhat different, and therefore will probably be controversial. I do just want to point that out. But what my view essentially is because this kind of boils down to is the question of predestination versus free will in a lot of ways, right? And I think that the answer is basically yes. Like I would think that everything is predestinated in a sense, and the Bible says predestinated by foreknowledge, which I think is a literal definition of like I know what this person will do if I give them free will. And personally, I think if God is truly omniscient, I think he would also have to know what would happen if, so like, for example, we had this debate today, right? I think if God is truly omniscient, he would have to know what would have happened if we did not have this debate today. So I do think that he does know all possible scenarios, as well as the scenarios that will actually take place. But the way I would kind of describe it, I would go kind of back to the fiction example. And I would say, so in a fiction, you notice that all of the characters are predestinated by the pen, if you will, right? We've mentioned Luke and Star Wars, and we've mentioned Rorschach and Watchmen. In both of those examples, whether it's George Lucas or Alan Moore, the author themselves is ultimately pushing forward each of the individual actions. But within the narrative of the story, the people do have free will. And what I would say is that is an almost perfect type of the way that God kind of does it here, with the exception being that God being an actual creator rather than just writing a fiction, we truly do have that free will. And I know that that's somewhat of a contradiction in a way. I have not reconciled that belief in the most logical way myself. I just need to be completely upfront with that. But I think it has to be somewhat of a both and I've even come up with a term for it.
What is it? Yeah, you said you came up with a term for it?
Oh, yeah. So I personally came up with a term for it, and I plan on writing a book about this at some point, but I have so many ideas, to be honest with you, that it's and I'm lazy. That's the big other problem. That's why I have so many ideas, right? Is because I just don't work on them, and then more come. But nonetheless, homolethia, which is the idea of simultaneous truths, which it's like a paradox. The way I phrased it is simultaneous truths which are commonly held to be contradictory, but are not, and may not have a proper explanation. I know that that's supposed to be what the word paradox is for, but nowadays we use the word paradox to describe things like, for example, the paradox of the boat and stuff like that. So I figured since paradox had changed, I would kind of just have a term here and it's a homolethia. It's a combination of, it literally translates from Greek as simultaneous truths.
Well, I think that maybe one of the problems there with paradoxes and the homolethia that you're talking about is that since we are not in possession of enough knowledge of the situation and the consequences, how everything came to be and will be eventually, the absence of our understanding of the whole situation leads us to see an imperfect, incomplete picture. And since we see an imperfect, incomplete picture, it appears to be contradictory to us. So I heard that. I've got one of my own. That's something I understand very well and I relate to very well, if you agree. I mean, I'm just assuming that you do agree with that it is a result of us not seeing the full picture, so it appears to be paradoxical.
Exactly. And that is sort of, and I could even give a really good example in the sense that, they often, I should specify who I mean by they. There's the common quote unquote scientific fact that the aerodynamics of bees doesn't, specifically bumblebees, doesn't actually make any sense. You know what I mean? And because if you think about it, if it happens in reality, by definition, it does make sense. You just haven't figured out how it is yet. And I think that whether or not that's actually a true fact, I don't really know because I'm not up to date on the science of bumblebees. But nonetheless, it would be one of those things where, that I think that's a really good example. We do indeed have these things they have to make sense because they occur. And of course, to a certain extent, that's presuppositional on my part because I do, of course, assume a God in that little soliloquy I just gave. But nonetheless, they occur, so they must make sense. We just don't necessarily know how they make sense. And so, like you said, exactly, they appear to be paradoxical. And I would even say, Isaiah says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, speaking on behalf of the Lord. But also, that question that God asked Job in the speeches he has about the rain on the dust where no man is right now. Of course, in the modern day, we do have a scientific explanation for that now. But if you think about asking that question to Job, I mean, that's a crazy question to consider, right? I don't know. Why does God send rain on the Sahara Desert where basically nothing at all lives? And of course, there are some things that do live there. That is part of the reason. But another part of the reason is, the water cycle and so on and so forth, right? And Job just has no possible way of knowing that, right? And the point in that question is very simple. I being God, am fully aware why I send rain on the dust where no man is. You, on the other hand, probably have not even considered it. You know what I mean? And I think that is an important point, not only for the Christian to grasp, but also for people who are just interested in understanding really any omnipotent God claim. I would say that the Sikh and the Jew and the Muslim and the Mormon and so on would probably argue very similar to what I'm arguing right now, honestly.
I think that you have very well articulated with this distinction between homolithia. Is that what you called it?
Yeah, homolithia. So it's Hamal. And you know what? Let me double check the spelling because it's going to be ETHIA after that. But I just want to make sure that I'm spelling my own term correctly.
So I've never heard that.
Yeah, so that, to the best of my knowledge, I am the originator of that. The reason for that, right? I don't mean to be getting too heady and thinking that I can just invent all these terms and stuff. But it just seemed to me like there was no term in academia to properly describe that idea. And Ben Shapiro says all the time, two things can be true at once. And I always wondered when I would watch whatever it is that he had to say on a certain issue, why is there not just a word to describe that if that's such a common theme in the discussion of truth? So I literally just put the words simultaneous and truths together in the Greek words together and sort of doctored them a little bit so they would make sense with each other. But
so that you've articulated that very well, and I think that you have every right, every reason to turn that into something and to claim it as a word that you have defined to mean something that I've never heard before. And it also fills a hole in articulating and comprehending the sorts of miscommunications and misunderstandings that everyone, regardless of their position, ends up having trying to explain these complex ideas. And regardless of whether or not you identify as a Christian or consider yourself an atheist, that is going to explain things much better than just saying, I don't know. You can say that that's what it appears to you mean to an extent. that is as far as we're going to get on some of the bigger issues that we have to deal with in life, is accepting that this is never going to make sense. Such as, I'm assuming here that you would apply that to the Trinity. I don't know. I haven't heard you talk about that, but I would imagine it falls into that category.
Well, so I don't necessarily know. I would say yes, in the sense that it is certainly falling into that category, because it is certainly something that the Godhead is very complex. I prefer the word. So I used to, just to be upfront with you, I used to claim modalism, which is the idea that God is one person and made and goes into being three different modes, so to speak, or manifestations. I don't necessarily anymore, because I don't think that I have seen some arguments made in numerous points that have kind of changed my opinion on that in a lot of ways. But at the same time, I do think that the word Trinity does not do proper justice to what is communicated in the Christian Godhead. I like Michael Brown's term triunity. That is the literal meaning of what Trinity is. So he's only kind of breaking down the word itself. But I think when you start having these, just when you say separation of persons, right, what that communicates to the human mind is significantly different than what any, Christian apologist I've ever heard is actually trying to communicate, with the exception of like Mormons and Seventh-day Adventists and people who are quite literally tritheist. Like James White, for example, when he describes what he means by persons, they don't mean what we mean by persons. They mean what they meant 2,000 years ago by persons, right? But it's become way too convoluted over the years. So I think that's a long way of me saying yes, that is certainly in that concept, but it's a little bit different.
Well, to be honest, coming into this debate, I didn't expect us to be in agreement on this as much as we have been. So it's probably been very boring to the people who have watched to see an atheist and a fundamentalist presuppositionalist Christian agreeing on the state of evil, but there we have it. I think that's really the only way that it's ever made sense to me when I've looked at it, when I've tried to make sense of it. And I really appreciate you giving me that word now to add to my lexicon of explaining what I mean more carefully. The last time I appreciated a new word that much, it was sonder. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but it's a good one.
I don't think I am, but I think I will definitely get familiar with it.
It's SONDER. It's a good one.
For sure. Let me actually write that down real quick. Let me see how much.
We should be right at it.
Yeah, about 1 minute and 50 seconds. So what I will do to kind of eat up that time, because I do have a question for you. The book of Ecclesiastes kind of, and I think this is a flaw a lot of times in Christian apologetics, it does paint a picture that is relatively bleak about human existence, right? Of course, it ends on a high note, but it is something that is absolutely, nihilistic, I think is the best way to put it in a lot of instances, talking about the meaninglessness of, basically everything. He goes through knowledge, he goes through living righteously, living hedonistically, so on and so forth, right? In your view, does the idea that the Christian, at least the Bible, let me rephrase that, does the idea that the Bible is a little bit more sympathetic to these nihilistic and cynical philosophies, and does at least attempt, in your view, to explain it? Does that sort of build a bridge at all to you?
Yes,
to Christianity?
it does.
Okay.
It does. If nothing else, I think that the reason there are so many Christians and that it is such a dominant, not just belief system, but foundation for philosophy across our culture. I think the reason that it has worked so well is because it does make more sense than any of the other religions out there, as far as Judaism and Hinduism and Islam and, on down the list of, all the way back to the mythologies. It does a better job in making sense of them than any of those. And one of the reasons for that is addressing things like nihilism, which is a very hard thing to bring up and talk about and look at, and even harder to think about in your own head just for its own sake. So the fact that it does address that, it does build a bridge, yes.
Awesome. I actually appreciate that a lot, because I come to the conclusion within myself, and I want to obviously get the opinions of non-Christians on this, but I've come to the conclusion within myself that philosophically speaking, a lot of the great philosophical leaders, quote unquote, like whether it's Schopenhauer or Plato or everything in between, right? Confucius, you can bring a bunch of them in. They actually tend to agree with a lot of the philosophy laid out in the Bible. It's just people tend to ignore, in my opinion at least, a lot of the philosophy laid out in the Bible. Like the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job are some of the least discussed verses and scriptures in that book, in my opinion. And I think that's a somewhat of a negative. And I understand, because it definitely scares people. The story of Job, a lot of people think of the story of Job and they just think to themselves, well, if I start telling this story, people will just leave the faith. And quite frankly, maybe those people didn't have such a strong faith anyway, if that story is going to cause them to do so. But avoiding it is what causes that problem in the first place. And so I am glad to see a little bit of kind of common ground established in a way. Or I think bridges is a better word to use, not necessarily common ground, but, Well,
honestly, it's frustrating to me to be a part of this or any community of people sharing different beliefs, whether they're very outspoken, hateful atheists, or deists, defend a closed mind in terms of being willing to listen to other ideas. It's one thing to have the conclusion that you turn out with at the end of the discussion or wherever you've arrived in your life, to have it different than from someone else. It's a completely different issue altogether to not listen because you don't want to hear what they have to say. If someone cares enough to talk to you about it for its own sake, because it's important to them, and if you care about other people, then you listen. That's what you do. And I have as much disdain for atheists who act that way as I do for anyone who just shouts hate. I don't care who they are.
Well, and I appreciate that, because I have already ruffled some feathers for my willingness to call out some Christians who do the same thing as well. So I'm glad that that's something that can be, agreed on for members of both sides, because I think it's necessary.
That's called integrity.
Exactly. And frankly, nobody wants to talk to a group of people that doesn't have integrity. And the people who do have integrity get labeled as people who don't have integrity because of members of the group who don't have integrity, which is unfortunate, but it's true. Nonetheless, so our time frame that we did agree on before did call for 5 to 10 minute closing statements. I guess we sort of talked about that beforehand, but would you like to go ahead and do that? And then anybody who's go ahead.
If you want to, I'm fine with that. I don't really have anything else to add to what we've discussed. I think we've ended this on a very positive note in terms of gaining better understanding And I especially appreciate that since you are a presuppositionalist and you do believe that I know God, but am not acknowledging that he's real, you have still treated me with consideration. And whether I deserve it or not, I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think that that's something that could certainly be passed on. I will be honest with you. There are some people who are pretty good at it. I think if you've ever talked to James White is my personal favorite presuppositional apologist. I think he can be.
I've talked to Cy 10 and we had a great discussion in about 2014, but he wasn't at all like the sound bites that you hear of him being so I can't even think of the words. Divisive. That's the one. He wasn't that way at all. But I would love to speak to James White. But I have heard very good things about him.
James is a double-edged sword, though, my man. Let me tell you what. He is simultaneously a total sweetheart and a ruthless orator as well. You know what I mean? So it actually reminds me a lot, to use an atheist example, of Alex O'Connor from Cosmic Skeptic, if you're aware of who he is.
I'm not.
He's kind of another example of somebody who's like, he's real solid with the rhetoric, and he can give you a lashing for sure. But at the same time, he really is an honest interlocutor and a very genuine person. And it's an interesting combination. I strive to be like those two. That said, I'm going to look through this live chat and see if anybody asked us any questions before we go, because that's kind of the only thing. I wouldn't have anything really to add. Honestly, it's kind of why I was asking about the closing statements. But nonetheless, let's see. So the first, I do see one that would look like it's directed towards me. Do you think Job happened? I would just answer that pretty quickly. Yes, I do believe that's history. You can go ahead and add whatever you like on that.
I'm not sure what you're asking me.
So Korag Nightwolf asked in the live chat, do you believe Job actually happened? In other words, like, is that a historical story?
It isn't to me, but the reason that I reject Christianity is based on my own presuppositions and my standard for accepting other presuppositions. As you and I have both agreed in this discussion, that presuppositions are necessary to a degree. So if I grant the presuppositions involved with Christianity and accept, if I accept the Bible is true based on those, then I would say that what I understand of the Bible would mean that it's probably more like a legend that had some truth along the way, but isn't necessarily exactly what happened. I would have to do more research to say definitively one way or another on how scholars are interpreting it to be metaphorical or a literal historical event. Because if I were a Christian, I would do my best to keep my understanding of the Bible in line with people who spend their entire lives understanding the Bible in its original language, what their conclusions are. That's what I would listen to. So I would have to say that I don't know. I'm in ignorance about that.
All right. Let's see. Some of these don't look like questions. Korag asks, you're a presup. That's odd. I would never know. Yes, I am a presuppositionalist. So I have a little bit of a theory about presuppositionalism. I think that if presuppositionalism is true, then evidentialism should also be true as well. So I can kind of switch back and forth depending on who I'm talking to, because it seems to me that if it's true that, for example, God is the basis of logic, then I should be able to use logic to prove that God is the basis of logic. So I find the distinction to be unnecessary. I find it to be a reason that a lot of people just use to bash on the opposing side, quite frankly. I'm not afraid to call out such a thing. I'll be perfectly honest with you because I have zero patience for it. But nonetheless, that's kind of the idea. I think that you should be able to, if you truly are a presuppositionalist, I think you should be able to argue with somebody based off of their presuppositions, because if your presuppositions hold true, you should be able to use the evidence that exists in reality to prove them.
I think that's a very wise way to approach things. I think that you can't reject one or the other. You have to use both.
Fully agree. Let's see. Outcast American says there's a lot of hidden truth in entertainment. Absolutely agree. You should look at Plato's philosophy on tragedy and comedy. Smoky Saint, oh no, angels have no free will, ? Smokey, you might know better than me on that one. Like I said, I'm really not clear. Part of me thinks that Lucifer's fall means there has to be free will in angels, and another part of me thinks that there's clearly some differences between humans and angels that are maybe not 100% fleshed out because they're not necessary. So I don't necessarily know. Matthew, if you'd like to comment, you certainly can.
No, I don't think I have any comment on that. I would just be speaking in ignorance. I really don't know.
All right. And it's also Smokey, he says, remember, in context, it is a position, not an entity. And he's speaking about Satan. And that is true. There is certain, and some people have posited that the Satan of Job is actually not the same as the Satan of Mathew. That's one of Michael Heiser's theories. So that's
interesting.
So the basic opinion of it is actually, so in the Hebrew, Satan in Job was actually referred to as Hasatan, which is the definitive article. And, some languages will tolerate the definitive article before what is not actually necessarily a definitive thing, but English and also Hebrew do not. And so we actually have the unique ability of understanding why scholars who do know the Hebrew, since we speak English, right, who do know the Hebrew would see that as very odd, and referring to somebody who would be the accuser in a literal translation, not necessarily the person who's named Satan. I would personally posit that Satan is a title always, and that therefore they are the same person. And when Jesus is referring to Satan, I would posit that he is not actually calling him by his name, right? The same way when he would call God Theos, he's not referring to God by his name, right? He's just using a title. And that his name would be Lucifer, just like in the case of God, his name would be, I believe, Jehovah, but some people say Yahweh.
I think that is something that maybe we have a tendency in our culture to do way too much, is anthropomorphize everything. Your car is and ships are women. You talk about things as if they're people a lot of times, and if Satan is ultimately just a role, a position of opposition, then it would make sense, culturally speaking, why so many people tend to think of Satan as a singular entity, as opposed to the personification of opposition to God. It's interesting.
I definitely agree. So we also have Smokey Saint again. Thank you, Smokey, for bringing out all these points. I'm actually loving a lot of them. This one is something I should have brought up. He says, thematic, essentially, he must create a free will creature, otherwise it is incapable of the expression of love. I would posit the word true ahead of love there, just to kind of make the point a little stronger. But I think that's more directed towards you, if you'd like to respond there.
No, I would have to think on that one before I could respond coherently.
Okay. All righty. Outcast American asks, is he supposed to be an archangel like Michael? I assume he's referring to Satan. No, he is not listed as one of the archangels. A lot of the archangel literature is extra biblical. For example, allegedly there are 7 archangels. I don't know necessarily if that's true or not. I'm just not an expert on the issue. I would defer to somebody like Michael Heiser. He will definitely know more about that. But I do know enough to say Lucifer is not listed as an archangel.
I would like to go ahead and respond to Smokey's question about, or observation about, free will being necessary for love.
Yeah, absolutely.
That really makes me wonder if would angels then granting if angels have free will, would they love God? Or would they just be serving? I guess we do the same thing, again, anthropomorphizing our pets, saying that our cats and our dogs love us, but do cats and dogs have free will? Can the theme, granting all of this as a narrative, that it is a necessity for love to exist. That's a whole other perspective on it. But if free will is necessary for love, then that would certainly make sense. But if God is love, anyway, as I said, it's a rabbit hole. So if you have other questions, I did say tell Nicholas that I would be having a discussion with him after. So I am trying not to ramble too much.
Absolutely, and he's in the live chat right now, by the way. So we'll probably have a question from him at some point. I'm going all the way down. There might be a little bit too many. I didn't expect this many people to watch. I got to be honest with you. It only appears to be like 10 or 13 in the live chat, but I did expect 1 to 2. I'm not particularly popular, but who cares? I guess this is cool.
Well, the way I look at it is that the people who end up finding you are, it doesn't matter how many it is. They're the people who are looking for this sort of content. So that's what matters.
I definitely agree to that, because I've found many on all spectrums, including, some Muslims and Jews and so on, who I do listen to a lot just because I like them as honest interlocutors. Let's see. Smokey Saint says, actually, Outcast American comes first. He says, cherubs are different. Once again, I would defer to, and he says that with a question mark, I would defer to Michael Heiser on a lot of that stuff. I am not the best at explaining a lot of the angelic beings and their nature. I'll be 100% honest. I've never looked into it too much because I've always been really interested in historicity and ethics, which is, I guess, my own personal flaw. But I would just defer to somebody like Heiser on that. I believe cherubs are alien, or not. Why do I keep saying aliens? I think it's because I watched that Hugh Ross debate on alien abductions. I was shocked to know that he actually thinks there's something to alien abductions. That was weird. But anyways, nonetheless, I think that cherubs are angels, if I'm not mistaken. But go ahead.
No, I didn't have anything to add.
Okay. Smokey does say we are in a fallen state, so we are not liberated from the pull of evil. True freedom is the freedom to be ultimately free of evil. And I think that would be a little bit more. That's a comment that would be a little bit more directed towards you, if you'd like to respond.
I think that in the short term, I would agree that in specific circumstances, specific moments, choices, in the act of free will, you could successfully choose an absence of evil. So purely good. In one act, you could do that. I don't think we could do that across. I don't think it's possible at this point for us to make it through life without ever, according to the Bible, sinning somehow, doing evil, falling away from the mark. But yeah, I think that if you just take it on a case-by-case basis, that makes sense that you could do perfectly good one moment and then not the next. So if it is a matter of tallying it up by whatever standard at the end of our days, then again, that's just another rabbit hole. I'm like you with your aliens in the back of your head. They're distracting you. I've always got those things, trains running both directions in my head too. So
yeah, I feel that.
Let me.
Looks like a lot of the stuff in the live chat turned out to not be questions so much as people conversating with each other. So that is helpful, actually, because I can skip a lot of it. Smoky Saint asks, has Mathew called out an atheist? Question mark.
Constantly. Typically about how willfully ignorant and resentful atheists can be about needing to defend their own positions. That is probably my biggest pet peeve when it comes to these discussions is having an atheist say, no, atheism is just a lack of belief, which means I don't have to defend my position at all. I don't have to explain anything to you, prove it. I don't have to say anything to you. It's all on you. It's naive and it's ignorant. And I call people out on that all the time. That's the biggest one, but I have, especially when I was doing much more 5 or 6 years ago, I had some atheists who were fairly well known that just hated my guts for the things that I said and for the way that I talk to Christians, like I'm talking to you now. They hated me for that. Because naturally, through the course of these discussions, I would end up talking about people like them and why I don't think they should be doing what they're doing. And there is admittedly a great deal of anti-authoritarian and anti-establishment psychology involved in atheism. There's no denying that. Atheism is like herding cats, has been said so many times, and that leads anyone who perceives there to be someone else telling them what they should do rather than what they are doing to immediately rebel against that. And I do what you do, and I try to be as honest and maintain as much integrity as I can, even if it's an atheist saying something stupid. But that, usually you end up picking what seems to be the most egregious issue to talk about at any given moment. And often, things that I disagree with that an atheist says will go unsaid because I'm addressing something else that a Christian has said that I disagree with more. So it's all to degrees.
All righty. So Nicholas is in the live chat. He says, please let Mathew know I emailed him a link. So I'll go ahead and I guess I just did let you know that by reading it. Smokey said, well, first I do want to point out, Smokey says Matt's responses are thoughtful. Give him kudos from me. And also says later on, Matt is a very honest interlocutor. Respect. So I do want to share those with you. So, and this is the last comment we got, it looks like. So from Smokey saying again, response to Matt, ultimate free will includes the ultimate freedom to never commit evil. Free will on a love spectrum is possible, no love needed. Free will to love a little or love a lot. And obviously, of course, these thoughts are limited somewhat by the the character count that you can have. But what would you respond to with that? Man, that's almost a topic for a whole video, Smokey. Sorry, go ahead.
I appreciate the praise and the idea of any sort of love being some degree of good. It's hard to separate that from, love itself, the expression of it. As you said, that's a topic for a whole video on its own, because it's a question of love expressed towards what, felt towards what. People tend to love themselves a bit too much most of the time, and to love material things too much. But if you're just talking about love of goodness and trying to make the world a better place in the best way that you understand how, and contribute to that and express that positivity, and that is towards God if you're a Christian, towards humanity if you're a humanist, then I think that the value is in the love itself, and a little or a lot is still important, regardless of whether it's one word or 5,000. I think that it's I seriously doubt that I'm actually answering the question that was embedded in that point of his, but I do understand, I think, what he was trying to say. So I like to type out answers, because you can then go back and edit, take this section out and put it over here and erase that word and stop using so many adjectives, and I would end up deleting half of what I just said. But I do think that's a good point, and it's a good perspective to have on the importance of love in contrast to sin.
Well, and if it makes you feel any better, I 100% get that sentiment. My last two debates, the one here now with you and my last one with Mrs. Avalon, are the first two debates where I actually pre-prepared remarks, because I noticed that I get like way rambly sometimes, you know what I mean? And I need to have a coherent, straightforward thought. And, there's an old quote by Denzel Washington that says he still takes acting lessons. And without comparing my debating skills to Denzel Washington's acting skills, because that would just be way too arrogant of me. But if somebody who is that phenomenal at his art is still kind of, finding ways to improve it, then I think that we should all try to find ways for our particular art or craft as well. And I think one of the easiest ways to do that is just write your comments down, man.
Cool. And also, to quote Denzel, one of my favorite sayings from him is practice, not perfection. Progress. I think he says progress, not perfection. I think that was in The Equalizer. But he said progress, not perfection. And I think that is a very good way to approach things. If you set yourself up for perfection in all things and don't allow yourself the capacity to fail, then you're not actually learning anything, and you are destined to be disappointed. So I think he's a very wise man in some cases.
No kidding at all. Smokey actually just commented, he's like, it says, LOL, CJ is a little long-winded, but I love you anyway, bro. Very true, though. That is a flaw that has now been pointed out. That's now Smokey just now, James from Modern Day Debate, Skylar, and the Raging Atheist have all pointed out to me which to be fair, I appreciate, because, got to get that under control if I want to do this more often. Love you too, all, by the way, Smokey. Nice to have brothers in Christ in the live chat. And we love you in humanity, all of the atheists here as well. You know what I mean? This is a great conversation. I consider you guys at least my brothers in humanity. And I hope to have many more conversations like this. So I think we are going to head off now. Looks like we're about up to almost 2 hours, but that was expected. And anything else you'd like to say, Mr. Steele, or where can people reach you to your content?
I'm mostly just I don't make many videos on my channel anymore. I've made probably close to 100 over the years, and I just end up deleting them. I've got them on a hard drive, but I just leave up a few that I like particularly. Most of what I do and what I will be doing will be in discussions like this and on Modern Day Debate and just talking to people in person, because just throwing an idea out there in a video and leaving it for other people to discover later sometimes is good and helpful. And sometimes people will say, I really appreciated that. I like what you did there. But I would prefer just to, in real time, talk to people and see what they think and see how they react. And when you're forced to talk on your feet, so to speak, answer in real time, you get a good sense of who's being honest and who's not. You get a good sense of what people's intentions are, because most people are not good liars. When they're trying to lead you somewhere and it's obvious that they're doing it, I would rather just ask me the question and you can get to the crux of the issue much faster. And although we ended up agreeing so much in this video, in this discussion, we got to do this again and find something we actually seriously disagree with, and we can hash it out and have some good old conflict going on and throw some rhetoric back and forth. Let's work on that next time.
Yeah, for sure. I think so. Like I said, I do tend to be focusing on historicity and ethics. So if either of those things, if you have a specific topic, any of those things that interest you, I'm certainly okay with that. But really, there is other points outside of that too that I will certainly debate. Existence of God, resurrection, stuff like that. I'm certainly willing to do so.
Awesome. Well, that's all I've got. I mean, I really appreciate this.
Absolutely. I appreciate it to you as well. And by the way, Smokey Saint has invited you to his open mic tonight, which I believe is at, correct me if I'm wrong, Smokey, 10:45 Eastern time. Is that correct? Well, he'll I don't know how much the lag there is, but he'll let us know, guys.
Smokey, I appreciate that, but I've already agreed to talk to Nicholas tonight, and my wife just got home from work during this debate, so I don't think I better do 3 tonight. I need to keep it short if I can. So I'm going to go spend some time with her for a little bit and then come back on and talk to Nicholas, and then I'm going to have to go to bed. But I appreciate the offer.
All righty. And he does actually confirm it was 10:45 if anybody in the audience was interested. But shalom, friends. Thank you very much for watching this. This was obviously a really good conversation, actually. I'm happy to be having these because we're having some good conversations a lot recently. I had a good conversation with Skylar the other day. I've had good conversations with The Rage. I might have another pretty, maybe potentially heated one coming up. We'll see what happens. Heated in a good way, of course, not heated in a bad way, but nonetheless, shalom all. God bless. Thank you very much for being on here, Mr. Steele. And you guys have a good rest of your day.